US-Canada conflict news. To understand why China moved so quickly to welcome Canada back into its market, you have to look beyond canola, beyond electric vehicles, and beyond any single trade flow. Beijing's long-term strategy has never been about one commodity or one partner. It has been about restructuring the global economic map in a way that slowly, methodically reduces dependence on the United States while increasing everyone else's dependence on China. What happened in Beijing with Mark Carney is not an isolated event. It is a textbook example of how that strategy works in practice. For more than a decade, Chinese policymakers have been watching Washington's trade behavior with growing interest. Not because they believe tariffs alone can destroy the American economy, but because tariffs, unpredictability, and public threats do something far more useful. They weaken trust. And in international trade, trust is more valuable than any single market. Supply chains are not built only on price. They are built on reliability, on expectations that the rules will not suddenly change because of a political speech or an election cycle. When that expectation disappears, countries and companies start looking for insurance policies. Trump's approach to trade has been a gift to Beijing in this regard. By treating trade relationships as zero-sum games and allies as interchangeable with rivals, Washington has created an environment in which even its closest partners feel compelled to hedge. Canada is not unique. It is simply the most visible case because of how deeply integrated it is with the US economy. When a country that sends roughly 3/4 of its exports to the United States starts actively building alternatives, that is not diversification. That is a warning. From Beijing's perspective, the Carney deal accomplishes several objectives at once. First, it restores access to a reliable supplier of agricultural commodities at a time when China is increasingly sensitive to food security. Canadian canola is not just a trade product. It is an input into a much larger system of animal feed, cooking oil, and industrial processing. Second, it opens a new channel for Chinese electric vehicles into North America, even if indirectly. Third, and most importantly, it sends a signal to every American ally. There are other doors, and China is willing to open them. This is how alliances erode in the real world, not with dramatic announcements or formal ruptures, but with quiet adjustments. A new contract here, a new port investment there, a new logistics corridor somewhere else. Over time, these adjustments harden into new realities. Infrastructure gets built, standards get aligned, business relationships deepen, and then, when politics change again, it turns out that going back is far more difficult than anyone expected. The European Union is already moving in this direction. The long-stalled trade agreement with Mercosur, the South American bloc that includes Brazil and Argentina, is suddenly moving forward. India is negotiating multiple agreements to reduce reliance on any single market. Even Mexico, now the largest US trading partner by volume, is watching the US-Canada-China triangle very carefully and running its own scenarios. The pattern is obvious. Countries are not waiting for Washington to stabilize. They are building contingency plans. What makes the Canadian case so important is the timing. The USMCA review is scheduled for July 2026. In trade policy terms, that is almost tomorrow. The original negotiation took years, and that was in a political environment where all sides fundamentally wanted an agreement. This time, Trump has already declared the framework irrelevant. Canada has just demonstrated it is willing to look elsewhere. Mexico is stuck in the middle, trying to maintain access to the US market while not becoming collateral damage in a geopolitical standoff. The most likely scenario is not an immediate collapse, but prolonged uncertainty. One-year extensions, rolling negotiations, constant threats. That kind of environment is poison for long-term investment. Companies do not build billion-dollar factories when they do not know what the tariff regime will look like next year. They wait, they slow down, they hedge. That is how economic momentum dies quietly. And this is exactly where the concept of supply chain paralysis becomes more than a metaphor. Modern supply chains are not just about moving goods. They are about synchronized planning across dozens of countries, hundreds of suppliers, and thousands of components. A single car can involve parts from 5 or 6 countries crossing borders multiple times before final assembly. That system only works if the rules are stable. When the rules become political weapons, the system does not collapse. It freezes. Agriculture illustrates this perfectly. Canadian grain exports to the United States are not a matter of ideology. They are a matter of logistics. Storage capacity, rail networks, milling facilities, and port access have been built on the assumption of open trade. If tariffs or quotas suddenly appear, the grain does not stop existing. It just has to find new routes, new buyers, and new infrastructure. That transition is slow and expensive. During that period, prices spike, shortages appear, and inefficiencies multiply. The same logic applies to automotive manufacturing, energy, chemicals, and even pharmaceuticals. Every time a company decides to delay an investment because it does not know what the trade environment will look like, that is a small act of paralysis. Every time a farmer hesitates about what to plant because market access is uncertain, that is paralysis. Every time a manufacturer builds excess inventory instead of expanding capacity, that is paralysis. From Washington's point of view, the tragedy is that this is largely self-inflicted. The post-World War II economic order, the system of alliances and trade agreements that made American companies dominant and American consumers wealthy, was built on predictability. It was not built on generosity. It was built on the understanding that stable rules benefit the strongest player the most. By abandoning that logic, the United States is not punishing its rivals. It is encouraging its partners to become less dependent. Beijing understands this dynamic perfectly. It does not need to convince countries to choose China. It only needs to make sure they no longer feel safe relying on the United States alone. The Carney deal is a case study in that approach. In Part 3, we are going to look at what happens if the USMCA review fails, what a true breakdown of North American trade would mean in practical terms for industries and consumers, and why the costs of that breakdown would be measured not in headlines, but in years of lost growth and permanently altered economic geography. To understand how serious the stakes are, you have to imagine a world in which the USMCA framework does not simply get revised, but effectively collapses. Not in a dramatic overnight explosion, but in the far more dangerous way complex systems usually fail, through slow, grinding dysfunction. Missed deadlines, temporary extensions, partial tariffs, retaliatory measures, legal disputes, regulatory confusion. None of these alone destroys a trade system. Together, they make it unusable. If Trump follows through on his threats and either withdraws from the agreement or imposes broad new tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the immediate effect will not be empty shelves or closed borders. The immediate effect will be uncertainty, and uncertainty is the most expensive commodity in the modern economy. Take the automotive sector, because it is the most tightly integrated and the most exposed. A single vehicle assembled in North America can contain parts that have crossed the US-Canada or US-Mexico border 5, 6, sometimes 10 times during production. Engines, transmissions, electronics, steel components, interiors, batteries, all moving in a carefully timed choreography. This system was not designed for tariffs. It was designed for speed, reliability, and predictability. Introduce tariffs, even modest ones, and the entire cost structure changes. Manufacturers are forced to choose between raising prices, absorbing losses, or restructuring their supply chains. None of those options is fast. None of them is cheap. In the short term, production slows. New model launches get delayed. Investment decisions are postponed. Workers are furloughed. Not because factories suddenly become unviable, but because management cannot make long-term commitments in a short-term political environment. And this is where the real damage begins. Once companies start planning for a world in which North America is no longer a single integrated production zone, they start looking elsewhere. They look at Southeast Asia, they look at Eastern Europe, they look at South America. Not because those places are necessarily better, but because they offer something North America is losing: stability. Agriculture faces an even more brutal adjustment. Canadian grain exports to the United States, those millions of tons of wheat, canola, and other crops, are not easily replaced. American farmers cannot instantly scale up to fill the gap. Infrastructure does not appear overnight. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers cannot simply stop producing. Crops keep coming. They have to be sold somewhere. If the US market becomes unreliable, those flows will redirect toward Asia, toward the Middle East, toward any buyer willing to commit. During that transition, prices become volatile. American consumers pay more. Canadian producers take losses. Storage facilities overflow. Transport networks become congested in some places and underused in others. And once new trade routes are established, once new buyers and sellers have adapted to each other, there is no guarantee those flows will ever return to their old patterns. Energy, chemicals, machinery, and even food processing follow the same logic. The modern economy is not a collection of independent national systems. It is a web. Pull on one thread and the tension spreads everywhere. What makes this moment especially dangerous is that the political incentives point in the wrong direction. Trump's trade strategy is built for domestic political messaging, not for system management. Tariffs are easy to announce. Retaliation is easy to frame as strength. The slow, invisible damage to supply chains does not show up in a single headline. It shows up over years, in lower investment, slower growth, and declining competitiveness. From Canada's perspective, the risk is existential. A country that sends roughly 75% of its exports to one market cannot afford to pretend that market will always be there. Carney's deal with China is not a pivot away from the United States. It is a hedge against American unpredictability, and once a hedge exists, it becomes part of the strategy. No serious government willingly returns to a position of total dependence after learning how fragile that position is. This is what Washington consistently underestimates. Trade relationships are not switches you turn on and off. They are ecosystems. Once those ecosystems start to change, they develop their own momentum. The USMCA review in July 2026 will not take place in the world that existed when the agreement was signed. It will take place in a world where Canada has already demonstrated it can and will look elsewhere, where Mexico is watching carefully, and where companies are already planning for fragmentation. The best-case scenario is prolonged uncertainty with temporary extensions. That alone is enough to suppress investment and slow growth. The worst-case scenario is a full reversion to pre-NAFTA tariff regimes. That would not just be a policy change. It would be an economic shock on the scale of a major crisis. And here is the cruel paradox. Trump believes he is restoring American leverage. In reality, he is encouraging everyone else to build alternatives to American leverage. Power in the global economy does not come from forcing people to comply. It comes from making your system so attractive and so reliable that others organize themselves around it. For 75 years, that was the United States. Not because it was perfect, but because it was predictable. The rules might not always have been fair, but they were stable. Businesses could plan. Governments could coordinate. Supply chains could stretch across continents with confidence. That confidence is now eroding. Not because China is conquering it, not because Canada is betraying it, but because Washington itself is dismantling the assumptions that made it possible. And the most dangerous part is that this process is largely invisible to the public. People notice when prices rise. They notice when factories close. They rarely notice when investment decisions quietly move somewhere else, when a new port is built in another country, when a supplier relationship shifts to another continent. By the time those changes show up in employment data or GDP statistics, they are already locked in. In Part 4, we are going to look at what this means for American power in the long term, why economic dominance is far easier to lose than to regain, and why the real legacy of this trade war may not be higher tariffs, but a world that has quietly learned how to function without the United States at the center of it. The greatest mistake in American economic history would not be losing a trade dispute. It would be losing the position at the center of the global system and not realizing it until it is too late to reverse. That is the real danger hidden inside what looks like a series of tactical decisions about tariffs, negotiations, and political posturing. For more than 7 decades, the United States has occupied a unique role in the world economy. It was not just a large market, it was the market around which other markets organized themselves. The dollar became the default currency for trade. American financial institutions became the clearinghouses of global commerce. American legal and regulatory standards became the reference point for contracts, shipping, insurance, and investment. This was not an accident. It was the product of stability, scale, and above all, trust. That trust is now being consumed faster than most people understand. What Carney did in Beijing is not an act of defiance. It is an act of adaptation. When the leader of a country that has been economically integrated with the United States for generations starts building parallel systems, that is not opportunism. That is risk management. And risk management, once institutionalized, does not get reversed easily. The same logic is spreading everywhere. Europe is building financial mechanisms to reduce exposure to US sanctions. Asia is increasing the use of local currencies in trade. The Middle East is experimenting with non-dollar energy contracts. None of this would be happening at this scale if the United States were still seen as a stable, predictable anchor. This is the part that American politics struggles to process. Power is not something you announce. It is something others rely on. The moment they start planning for a world where they do not rely on you, that power is already slipping. Trump's trade strategy is built on the idea that leverage comes from making others uncomfortable. In reality, leverage comes from making others dependent on a system they trust. When discomfort becomes the norm, countries do not submit. They diversify. And diversification is the enemy of dominance. Once Canada has a functioning agricultural and industrial trade corridor with China, that corridor will be used. Once European companies restructure supply chains to avoid US trade uncertainty, they will not casually reverse those decisions. Once Mexico deepens ties with alternative partners as insurance, those ties become part of its permanent strategy. The United States will still be a huge economy. It will still be a powerful country. But it will no longer be the unavoidable center. And history shows that losing that position is far easier than regaining it. The British Empire did not collapse because it lost one war. It collapsed because over decades, trade routes, financial systems, and industrial networks stopped revolving around London. By the time the political reality became obvious, the economic reality was already irreversible. That is the risk America is now taking. The supply chain paralysis we are starting to see is not a temporary malfunction. It is the first visible symptom of a deeper reorganization. Every delayed investment, every postponed factory, every rerouted shipping lane is a small piece of that reorganization. And once enough of those pieces are in place, the system flips. At that point, even a future American administration that wants to restore alliances and rebuild trust will discover how limited its options are. You cannot simply order companies to undo years of restructuring. You cannot force governments to abandon insurance policies they built to protect themselves from your unpredictability. Trust is built slowly, it is destroyed quickly, and it is rebuilt even more slowly than it was built the first time. This is why the USMCA review in July 2026 is not just a trade negotiation, it is a stress test for the entire North American economic model. If it fails, the message to the world will be unmistakable. Even America's closest partners no longer believe the old system is reliable, and if that message becomes accepted wisdom, the consequences will extend far beyond Canada, Mexico, or China. They will reshape global finance. They will reshape manufacturing. They will reshape energy markets. They will reshape the political balance of power, not in a dramatic crash, in a quiet drift, the most dangerous kind, because when people finally notice that the center has moved, it is usually already gone. That is the real story behind Carney's China deal. Not canola, not electric vehicles, not tariffs, but the slow, structural weakening of the position that made American prosperity possible for 3 generations. And the tragedy is that this is not being forced on the United States by its rivals. It is being chosen one decision at a time by its own political leadership. History will not remember this period as a series of trade disputes. It will remember it as the moment the world quietly learned how to live without organizing itself around Washington.